What's up, y'all? I'm KM Best. Weekend quests just dropped in Marvel Snap, and they include a quest to win 15 games with Patriot in your deck, so let's dive into my favorite Patriot list. Here is the deck. I am currently 5-0 in battle mode with it, which you take that for whatever it's worth, but I consider it to be a sort of hybrid between the old school Patriot lists and the new school Patriot lists with Iron Lad in it. So what we're hybridizing here effectively is, instead of going over the top like a lot of the Iron Lad lists are built to do with Iron Man and things like that, we're instead trying to drag the opponent down to our level, which is to say, we want our opponents to end up with less points than they expect. And we accomplish this with the trilogy combination of Invisible Woman, Shang Chi, and Killmonger. These cards are in a ton of decks right now for good reason. Being able to hide your ability to take your opponent's cards down is very, very powerful. Invisible Woman is actually pulling double duty here. So Invisible Woman not only is hiding your Shang-Chi, hiding your Killmonger, making sure they're always going to hit the maximum amount of targets possible, but she's also going to be hiding your Patriot, your Mystique, your Ultron, what have you. You can absolutely hide that stuff behind Invisible Woman as well. It is totally viable if you want to try to accomplish it in that manner. So Invisible Woman does multiple things in this deck. It's a very good shell for the Invis Killmonger Shang-Chi deck. And I think more than that, it has some game against other decks that run Invis Killmonger Shang-Chi because, you know, Ultron tends to get completely blown out by opposing Invisible Woman Killmongers. We have, in addition to Ultron, a Doctor Doom, other things that can put points on the board. It becomes a much more competitive matchup than if it was just playing the My Invisible Woman and Priority game against people playing Invisible Woman and Killmonger. Mystique is a card worth highlighting. It's a card that has gone out of a lot of Iron Patriot deck lists because it's not a very good card to hit off of Iron Lad, and it's a big step towards that hybridization that I talked about because we are not really a deck that needs to be playing Iron Lad anymore. We are losing a lot of the high rolls that Iron Lad contributes, so we don't have Iron Man in it anymore. We can hit Mystique, things like that. And so Iron Lad goes from being the tentpole card of the deck to being, you know, just a pretty good card. And the reason we have to do that is because other decks can go bigger than us. Even when we hit our Iron Lad high rolls, like we're only competing with the bounce decks, and they're doing it without high rolling. They're just playing what their deck does. So we need to get a little bit more small ball, a little bit more, you know, we're going to play Patriot and Mystique. We're going to blow up their stuff. We're going to put a Killmonger and an Ultron behind an Invisible Woman, stuff like that, right? So that all their one drops die and then our Ultron pops. Things along those lines are going to be a lot more how you're going to play these matchups, hampering your opponent with your tech cards and then using Patriot to capitalize is really the name of the game here. Ultron is, I think, a little bit non-negotiable, and it's kind of frustrating because obviously, you know, hitting Ultron off of Iron Lad, it's not great. It's not the worst thing you could do, but it's definitely not great considering sometimes you're going to be banking a Killmonger and Invisible Woman, things like that. So you do kind of have to run this card, though, and it's another step towards that old hybridization. We are not playing Onslaught, we're not playing Iron Man, we're playing fairer Patriot, with the idea being that we will consistently drag them down to our level and then beat them by putting, you know, 15 to 20 points in every lane while blowing up some of their stuff. That is the premise here, and Ultron really helps with that. Do keep in mind, people may try to Cosmo him if you put him in the Invisible Woman lane. I have seen some Cosmos in Invisible Woman lanes here because they want to turn off Mystique. So it's a pretty normal play to see, so you do have to keep that in mind. You're not always going to be able to just go full Invisible Woman, only play in the Invisible Woman lane if they have something like Cosmo. Killmonger, it might seem a little bit odd to run a Killmonger in your Ultron deck, but basically your job is to make sure they never conflict. And, you know, Killmonger and Ultron, both under Invisible Woman, is one common way of making that happen. But also, there's some times where you can just get some value out of a Killmonger against the deck, like High Evolutionary Lockdown, just because they're playing their one-cost cards early. So Killmonger right now is about as strong as he has ever been. And I think the combination of Invisible Woman and Killmonger is one of the defining attributes of the metagame right now, and it is forcing a lot of decks to adapt. So, for example, One of the games I played was against a Thanos list piloted by Liberation, Astrolad, excellent player, but it just doesn't seem like a winnable matchup when I'm playing Invisible Woman and Killmonger. It's just very, very hard for any deck that is reliant on spreading a bunch of one-cost cards across the board to get off the ground against Invisible Woman Killmonger, and it's actually better at beating those decks than it is at, like, beating Kitty Pryde decks, which it's pretty good at, and, like, the whole point of it is so we can beat Kitty Pryde decks and not have to worry about running wave, and yet, here we are just beating other decks actually harder than we beat the Kitty Pryde decks. You're not playing Shang Chi a lot. He's there for the matchups that you need him in, and he's not going to be very good in the matchups that you don't. Basically, he is there so that you are not absolutely dead to High Evolutionary Lockjaw, which is otherwise a very, very tough matchup for you to beat. But if you can win one lane with a Shang-Chi, you can win another lane by just stacking up points across all three, which you're very good at. Thanks to Ultron and Doom, you're good at distributing your points evenly. So as long as you steal one of the two lanes, they tend to go big in with a Shang-Chi. The third one, you're likely going to win by default because they don't go very big in 3 lanes very often. It's possible, of course, but they don't often do it. One card you're going to want to keep an eye out for in that matchup is Spider-Ham. He's going in a lot more of these Lockjaw decks now, and you should be aware of him. I think that it's not the worst thing in the world to get hammed. As long as you get one of your 6 drops on the board, you're usually going to be fine. But you are pretty reliant on playing at least one of them. If you have a hand that gets hammed and you never get to the other 6 drop, it can be a problem. Now, in terms of exclusions, I think Super Skrull is definitely one that's really worth talking about. Super Skrull, given that I'm making this video because of the weekend quests, you might want to consider this card because there are going to be people playing Patriot. After all, there's an incentive to play Patriot. There's an incentive to win with Patriot. So if you want to beat Patriot mirrors, playing Super Skrull is basically the best possible way to do it. It makes you almost unbeatable against Patriot decks that are not playing Super Skrull. I would expect the swap to be Shang-Chi, because what you're expecting when you play a Patriot deck here is, say, I expect more Patriots than High Evolutionary Lockjaws. In that situation, you'd be running Super Skrull over Shang-Chi. That would be how I would approach it if you expect a bunch of mirrors. If you don't, or let's say you're like playing the higher levels of Conquest, and you don't think people are going to be playing, you know, their farming decks in that mode, then you're going to want to stick with the Shang-Chi because of the ever-present threat of High Evolutionary Lockjaw. Finally, I wanted to address a little bit of deck building tension. Mr. Sinister and Brood, and of course Iron Lad hitting them, like, that's a little bit of anti-synergy, right? Because you are getting less out of your Ultron when you play these cards. But I find that they are extremely valuable just because of how much they cost. There are going to be a lot of situations, especially with Mr. Sinister, where your turn 5 is going to be a 3 cost and then Mr. Sinister. So just having that ability to split your turn 5 up, like let's say you want to put a Killmonger under the Invisible Woman, you do that on 5, you play a Mr. Sinister elsewhere, like, it's actually just very, very valuable. Despite the anti-synergy with Ultron, you get the positive synergy from, you know, if Iron Lad hits one of them, it's obviously incredible. So it's generally something that you should be aware of, that, you know, you don't necessarily always have to go super hard onto the board if you have an Ultron, but, you know, Brood is great at winning those lanes that reward you for getting ahead on them early, things like that. So you'll see some use from both of these cards, but honestly, the one that stands out to me is Mr. Sinister, who has just been an absolute all-star by virtue of literally just costing 2. Just costing 2 is so powerful in this deck because of the amount of 2+3 plays that you're going to want to make on turn 5. Mr. Sinister plus Patriot. You played a Patriot last turn, Mystique plus Mr. Sinister. There's a ton of this in this deck, and so he ends up being one of the more valuable cards and someone definitely worth talking about. I hope you enjoyed this new style of deck breakdown, or really old style of deck breakdown. A lot of them used to be like this before I started adding gameplay footage to them, just sort of information downloads. I wanted to go back to that because I mostly played this deck off stream, which is rare for me, but I had a day off today and I was just playing this deck off stream, and then boom, the quests hit, and suddenly it's like actually really valuable information because a bunch of people are going to be looking for, you know, what's the best Patriot deck. I do want to give a shout out. The majority of my thinking here, you know, it's pretty straightforward in terms of, this is the Iron Patriot deck, and then you make a couple changes, but RabbitSweet HS on Twitter won a SnapFan World Championship qualifier, I believe, with a list that ended up being just one card off of this. And the reason that I ended up looking at Patriot a lot harder was because of this. I'd been tooling around with Patriot like it was on my last tier list, but seeing that just really crystallized some stuff for me, which is like, wait, it's safe to play Ultron. It's okay. So they ended up being just one card off from me. They had an Iron Man instead of the Doctor Doom, and I did want to give them that huge shout out on that, because like seeing that, it's like it really sort of freed me up to make changes like, oh, you could put Mystique back in here and we could be an Ultron deck again. I'd been thinking along these lines, but it almost felt like I got permission. So it was really nice to see that. Huge shout out to them. And I also wanted to say that I do think that Doctor Doom is a little better than the Iron Man right now, partially for Spider-Ham reasons. You have multiple 6s that can get hit now, and partially because it's very difficult to deal with opposing Invisible Woman and Killmongers if you are only playing Ultron, because then it's just going by priority, and they're usually going to be able to throw priority against you. Your Ultron gets Killmongered, you absolutely die. So having Doctor Doom as a little out to that scenario is what I ended up with. If you enjoyed this, leave a comment, subscribe. I read every single comment. I really appreciate everyone who takes the time. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next one. As always, I've been KM Best. Later.